God has us here for such a time as this. What does that mean? What does that look like? Kind of the Francis Schaeffer mode of thinking. What does it look like to live for Christ, especially in the middle of a pretty dark and perverse generation? Doesn't mean that we should lack joy or good cheer, but we have to be well equipped to understand the schemes of the evil one. Quite frankly, we have an enemy, and he's been around a lot longer than we have, and he has chosen certain areas of attack that he believes will be successful. Ultimately, these are the thrashings of a defeated foe, right? But at the same time, he's not going down without a fight. And the battleground that I would never have predicted, nor would I have chosen, quite frankly, is the one that we're seeing crop up on every hand today. The loudest and the most self-righteous, perhaps pseudo-righteous, is on the front of gender ideology and gender indoctrination, in particular of our children. And I think every single day, if you're I don't know what they call it, red pill or what, if you're awake to this area, it will shock. It will shock and surprise you, the levels to which people have stooped, the extent that there is gender confusion and indoctrination, and it's happening in many cases right under parents' noses. Now, a lot of people are becoming more and more awake and more angry, I would say, with righteous indignation on this topic, but there are so many parents, so many children who have been affected, who have been influenced, people of all ages, really, but it's the targeting of children that I think we have to be equipped to deal with, particularly as men and women of God who want to train up our own children, the precious gift that God's given us. We have to be well equipped. It's not something that we can run away scared or hide under the nearest rock with a bunch of Bible verses. We have to be willing to confront the depths of depravity and to be able to stand boldly and say, no more. This is not going to happen here. And we will protect, we're going to protect our children. That's honestly has to be our motivation, our motivating factor. And it's something that I admire greatly, the voices that I hope will soon be joined by a chorus of others, but some of the few brave voices that have been speaking out and telling the stories. And one of those is at Christian Post. Highly recommend that you follow his work, as I do. Brandon Showalter is our special guest today. And man, his work is like a profile in courage all on its own. Brandon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rebekah. It's a pleasure.
You do some amazing thing, and you have for many years, but a lot of your writing has lately been focused on issues of gender dysphoria, but in particular parents and the rights of parents being abolished, being destroyed, and children's innocence, their very bodies being preyed upon by this wickedness. And I wonder if was this something you really set out to do, or was it a fight that kind of came to your doorstep unexpectedly? How did you come to focus on this area?
Definitely was not something I set out to do. I wasn't looking for this fight in particular. I mean, I am a sincere Christian, and I care about, the entirety of my faith, our faith, issues of the human person, sexuality and gender. Those things have always interested me because I see how integral they are to the furtherance of the gospel. But I wasn't aware of the extent to which children are being corrupted and targeted with this kind of insane perversion. And there's no other way to put it, really. I tell the story that I first encountered this dogma. I was aware of it before I started as a journalist in the summer of 2016, but I really became aware as you're in the news business, reporting the news of the day. My first day on the job, believe it or not, during my trial period, was the day after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. Oh. It was insane. And so I was thrown into covering all these LGBT issues, but I saw how, I think the Obergefell decision had come down about a year before that, and everything had shifted to all things queer and trans. And the thing that really alerted me to how deeply this ideology had become entrenched even then was how language was being manipulated in the press. I remember seeing, purportedly mainstream publications using she and her to describe males. And I thought, wow, this is an inversion of reality. And as a journalist, I want to convey the truth. I can't participate in this kind of twisting of words, because that's deceitful, and you can't just, it's one thing to be biased, but it's quite another thing to overtake our very means of communication and shape the thoughts in keeping with an ideology that warps language. I was just blown, my mind was blown by that. But even then, it takes a while to sort of wake up to the extent to which this has infiltrated and all of the new terms and new verbiage and all of that stuff. And so I sort of fell down the rabbit hole, as I like to say. But then what happened was I learned how this was a medical scandal. People ask me all the time, why do you care so much about trans and gender and all this? And I said, I'm a journalist, and I think medical scandals are eminently newsworthy, but it's not seen as such in the general public because it's wrapped in civil rights lingo, it's wrapped in rainbows, it's wrapped in all kinds of politically correct euphemisms. Meanwhile, the catastrophic harm that's being inflicted on children's bodies by way of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and disfiguring cosmetic, medically unnecessary gender surgeries just blew my mind. And so as soon as I learned about that, I like to say that something inside me snapped, and I was never the same since. And I've just been chugging away knowing that this has to be exposed, and I can't lend any credence to the manipulative lingo that frames this in much of the legacy media. That's the reason this has been able to go on for so long, is because they've overhauled the terms of the conversation, and they've cloaked what's really going on with the very thing that they should be using to expose the atrocities.
Oh, well, and that's so key. So I'd like to just park there as we're making the bridge into some of those self-same atrocities that you cover very well. So people should follow your work at The Christian Post and also on social media, because they're going to learn a lot that they probably wish they didn't know, but really need to, in order to be well equipped. Now, the mention of language and the altering of terms, the using of the propagandistic kinds of terms where we redefine language, and the side that gets to set the terms and define the terms is the one that ultimately wins. We know that, right? But so many of us have kind of gone along to get along when it comes to the manipulation of language. I was even just surprised by a pretty prominent Christian leader talking about whether or not we should use preferred pronouns. And well, maybe we should be in the spirit of charity. Maybe we should be using the terms that people prefer, and then we might have the open door to develop the relationship, to share the gospel, all those kinds of things. Whereas I don't think that we're allowed to participate in a lie and a delusion in order to, somehow lead that person to healing. And that's been a big problem for me personally. Is I think the people that know the truth are obligated to say it, to speak it kindly and to speak it in love. But now, because I think we've gone on too far down this delusion train, and we thought we were being good neighbors and kind, and now we find out that our own children are so confused and have fallen victim at incredibly young ages, by the way, which is what's going to come out in this conversation, that we lack the ability. We almost have no defense. If we haven't stood up against it or aren't willing to, then we won't even be able to protect our own children from being the targets of the enemy. And that is terrifying.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I will say it's easy to want to, be hard on it. And I'm not saying you were, to people who are trying to navigate this and extend. It's a very noble impulse to want to be hospitable and kind and deferential and gracious and compassionate. I totally applaud that. And I think that's what the Lord Jesus would do. And I certainly have compassion for people who are struggling, who have this kind of body dysmorphia or gender dysphoria. It's a very real thing. And I think a lot of people who experience it, a lot of what led to it is sometimes abuse and trauma. And so it's I don't want to make light of it at all, or just sort of mock it, even though there are, I think, people who, there's a whole conversation we could have about whether this is actually a fetish in certain types of men versus kids or young people who are dealing with this. But it's a very dicey thing too, because with regard to pronouns, pronouns have always denoted the sex of the body. That's just, they let us know whether a person is male or female. And so I have had a conversation with a detransitioner, it was a woman who underwent the experimental hormones, and I didn't think she had surgery, but she lived and presented as a man for a time. And the way her church approached it was, we love you. We want you to be part of our community. We believe and we know that you are, in fact, a female. We'll use a pronoun here and there, but we're putting you on a process toward reintegrating with your biological sex. Somehow they made it work. They used her preferred pronoun once in a while. That's a messy pastoral call to make that I think has to be made on a case-by-case basis. But generally, I'm of your opinion that you really can't participate in a lie or a delusion because it doesn't really help. But I don't want to make a hard and fast prescription because sometimes the work of pastoring is messy.
Sure.
And so I honor the noble impulse to be compassionate that many pastors say. But as a journalist and as someone who is, out there recording the first draft of history, and you're trying to understand what's really going on, it's unconscionable to use any of these terms because you remove all objectivity when you adopt the language whole cloth, and it's under this false notion of compassion. So it's a very different role to play when you're pastoring someone who's in the mire of a gnarly struggle versus you're trying to record the facts of what happened. And if you don't have the words, you don't have the tools with which to do that if you choose to use language that deliberately covers up something. And that's what's happening. It's just it's maddening to see that the truth of really what's happening can't get out because words are covering it up. And so people don't know because language shapes thought. These are two very different things. And so there's a bit of, we have to exhibit patience towards people who have different calls in this world where we're dealing with real people made in the image of God. But I have no patience for people who just gaslight and use this language because it purposefully deceives people. And I have no tolerance for that as a journalist.
Well, and it also just makes for incredibly confusing reading.
I couldn't even understand what I was reading when I first encountered. I would read through the body of an article. What are they even saying? Like, is that this person or this person? They called him she, but there was another woman in the article too. So was that? It's just I felt like my brain was put in a Cuisinart.
Well, it's so fluid.
Yeah.
It's so fluid, don't you know? So we could change pronouns and be talking about the same person and use 46 different pronouns in the course of one column, and we're supposed to follow it and act like that makes perfect sense.
Well, Time magazine just put out this article about that author that wrote that disgusting book, Genderqueer, where they have the kids talking about disgusting sexual things they were doing, and they used the pronouns for this author was it wasn't even a word, like ear and air. I mean, I couldn't even like. Spell check didn't help you on that one because that's a fake word, but they're literally using fake words in the news script. Like, mind blowing.
Editing, anyone? Like, you're supposed to be describing reality, not creating your own. But
here's the thing: I make such a big deal about that because it literally is. You may as well be speaking Urdu to me than when you speak this language because it just warps everything. You can't engage with it. Good faith debates are impossible because they won't. The people who are committed to this dogma will not in any way, because we have to have a common medium to explore what's really going on. And that's impossible because the language is captured.
Right, exactly. It's like if we're talking about the color of the walls in the room and one person says, well, I think they look blue to me. What do you think? And they're like, there is no room. It's nothing but, chameleon kumquat. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
There's this great, there's a podcaster who is not a Christian, and I think she's a feminist down in Australia. Her name is Sal Grover. It's the Giggle podcast. And she has this great line. She says, if you tell me that I'm going to paraphrase her. If you believe that some women have penises, I'm not going to trust a word you say, because if you'll lie to me about something so obvious, how can I trust you about lying about anything else? And it's just brilliant because she refuses to live behind a blockade of lies. And we have to do the same. If we value truth and reality, language, no, you're not going to corrupt my speech. No, no, ma'am. No, sir. Absolutely
Live not by lies. Yeah.
Come on.
Fun note that I'll have to tell you during the break that I think, my husband has been in the military and is calling people ma'am and sir as a sign of respect, but some people don't take it that way, and we may or may not be welcome back at our local Walmart because of it.
I was raised in Virginia. That's just how we roll,
Right, exactly.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, please.
Suddenly manners are offensive now. Oh, man. The difficulty, I think, for so many people, and it can be uncomfortable for those who are not wired in a confrontational way. I have different struggles. I really have no problem with saying uncomfortable things if I believe they're true and they need to be said. And God help me to speak them in love, but I'm willing to have that conversation. Right. I am. But there are many people who that's very difficult as a hurdle for them. And so they're struggling with what to do when this idea of gender confusion, gender fluidity, gender dysphoria has now exploded. It is everywhere. I mean, we had essentially a whole month and more dedicated to that. And the people in the highest positions of power all across the world are, coding everything in rainbows to indicate their proper virtue signals, and stand on that side. But it's almost like, all right, well, we're trying to play catch up in order to figure out the best way to defend. And the scariest things of all, the scariest battlefronts of all, are what has been done already and what is currently being done in the lives of our children, in classrooms. And the sheer speed and velocity with which our culture has completely changed and gotten itself wrapped around the axle is shocking to me. But I don't think we can turn a blind eye to it, especially as regards our kids.
Absolutely. No, I think if anybody, for what does it for most people is when they see children exploited. Though it's amazing to see how there have been people who, even that, they've been so brainwashed into this dogma that even when exploitation is happening right in front of their face, they don't even recognize it, because they've already bought into the presuppositions of an infinite number of gender identities, or they think of it as sexual orientation, or this sort of an extension of other things. And so they're then hesitant. And even if they have an objection to it, they're governed by fear of sounding a certain way. And so there's so many dynamics that this is just fraught with several layers of, how people think about these things. And then you combine that with, especially if you're a Christian, you do want to show compassion. Like that again, with that noble impulse, that's real, that's honorable. But I think what is really needed in this hour, particularly with regard to our kids, is discernment from the Holy Spirit, because many Christians who default to that compassionate stance often don't realize how that compassion can be wielded in a manipulative way against them. And so you've got to be tuned in to that still small voice of the Lord. You've got to be dialed in to the word. You've got to know what's being done, and that, yes, there are people that are consumed with wickedness that will use your good intentions against you. And then it's a quagmire. I see that so often, where I just want to shake Christian leaders by the shoulders and say, do you realize that children are being sterilized and disfigured? And I can show you the journal citation where it's happening. The legacy press is lying about it, but here you are wringing your hands about compassion, but you're not really speaking prophetically at all. Meanwhile, thousands more every day are being sent into this meat grinder. And I don't think that's too rude of an analogy, because when this invades a home, it's like a bomb goes off, to the point where I've had parents call me who are atheist, secular, not subscribers to any particular religious faith at all. And they tell me that they think they believe in the demonic because of the evil that manifests in front of their faces. It's just, it's an exquisite form of torture for these families that deal with this. And I've carried some of their suffering with me as I've done this, reporting over the years. I see their faces every night before I go to bed right there, because there's just nothing like it. And it's also new. You're right. That's within the last decade, this has exploded. And maybe we can talk about why I think it has been so fast. But I mean, use your discernment, Christians. You can't just default to wanting to be nice or kind and stop there. There's more to it than that.
Well, and I think the thing that I like to emphasize for people who are maybe a little trepidatious about stepping forward into this is that these are real people that are really being hurt, really being deceived, and sometimes in some ways irrevocably so. I mean, it's not nothing is beyond God's power to redeem, and he can do anything. And I'd like to get there by the end of the conversation, is look at the path towards redemption and the hope, even in the midst of this kind of level of darkness, because I believe that does exist. But we cannot be standing by. We can't be complicit by refusing to stand up and protect the innocent, protect our own children, but also to speak the truth by which we can set even the most evil and wicked lie can't stand up in the face of God's truth. And that's where our only power is, but I believe it's our obligation.
I have. Yes. Yeah.
And I think if this might be a great place just to take a quick break, and we'll discuss some of it. We'll dig down into it. We'll put on our waders and, and we'll get into the ugliness of the truth, because it is necessary for us to be well equipped, and be more than that, to be motivated to stand up and fight against this. This is not the battle I would have predicted or chosen, but it is the battlefront of our time. And I think each and every Christian has to be boldly confident to stand up and say, God's design is good. God has made us well. He loves you, and you are made in his image, and he knows the number of hairs on your head. He did not make a mistake with you. He proclaims his glory in the way he made you. And for anyone to manipulate that and to mar that and to try to deform that in the guise of making us feel a certain way for just a moment, there's no good there. That's not healing. That's not right. That's not compassionate. So I think if we get into what is actually happening, what actual hospitals are willing to do, what actual doctors are willing to do, these irreversible, it's butchery.
Yes.
And under the guise of medical care, we need to be informed so that we can be equipped and energized to stand up for what is good and true and right in this world. And Brandon Showalter is going to lead us in that because he's the one that knows about this as the senior investigative reporter over at the Christian Post. Follow his work on many things, but in particular on the gender confusion, gender manipulation that is going on in our country right now, really across the world as well. It's not just here. It's a global problem. So we're going to get equipped when we return. You're listening to FaithWorks Live.
Now is the time to stand for life. For 50 years, Iowans for Life has been the longest standing nonprofit pro-life organization in Iowa, and they stand strong today as Pulse Life advocates. They believe in defending the defenseless. And that's what we need now, a new generation to value the sanctity of all human life from fertilization till natural death. They advocate at the Capitol, in classrooms, at events across the state of Iowa on abortion, on family planning, on physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, basically every issue where the culture is so contrary to what God calls us to. They're standing in the gap as defenders of the defenseless, and they're a voice for the voiceless because they believe in the value of life. And if you do too, sign up for their newsletter and get involved today at pulseforlife.org. That's pulseforlife.org. At FaithWorks Live, we're proud to partner with InnerVisions Healthcare. In unplanned pregnancy and STD situations, they offer help and hope. It's all confidential and it's all free. If women are in a crisis pregnancy situation, they know that they can get real help at InnerVisions. Free pregnancy testing, free STD testing, free ultrasounds as well to see that inner vision. Because women deserve the truth about their bodies, about their baby, about all of their options. And if a woman has gone down the road of seeking abortion through medication and she regrets that decision, InnerVisions also offers abortion pill reversal procedure, which is a life-saving, miraculous option to have right here in our own community. InnerVisions Healthcare, well worth supporting, providing those free services to women in crisis pregnancy. You can call them 24 hours a day at 515-440-2273. That's 515-440-2273.
FaithWorks Live is the name of the show. It is my great joy to be with you, even when we have to talk about some difficult stuff. And wouldn't you know it, the devil won't let us rest. So he is active in trying to destroy all the things that God says are beautiful and wonderful. And I think he particularly targets children, and he targets the image of God that we see in male and female. God says that is very, very good. This is my design, to be fruitful and multiply, to abundantly flourish. This shows God's love for the world in who we are. And wouldn't you know it, the enemy hates all of that and is trying his best to stamp out the image of God as he sees it in the world. But we don't believe that he has the final word, but he is roaring loudly these days. And in particular, the gender indoctrination has so taken hold in the young generation, right? I think probably far more deeply than we ever would have predicted. It's scary how common. It's not just one little pocket here or there. It's not just in California or New York. It's going on, and it might be happening in your kid's school. Not to scare you unduly, but you better find out whether or not it's happening there, because unfortunately, many of us don't find out until after it has occurred. It's an after the fact sort of revelation that's being actively hidden from parents in many cases. And Brandon Showalter is our excellent guest. He is on the front lines of covering these disturbing stories, and he's spoken to many people whose lives are directly impacted by all of these lies. Brandon, one story, I mean, you've covered this and written extensively and very well about these very, very difficult stories, but one that I want to refer people to is that one that affirms, quote, yes, trans surgeries are being done on minors. Here's proof. And that's something that is being actively debated, especially in the Twitter sphere where everybody's an expert. And we have people saying, how dare you say that these esteemed hospitals are doing things that are illegal, they should not be doing. You're creating problems, you're falsely accusing them, but you actually have proof that maybe what they're saying and the things that they're willing to do when they think they're amongst friends are very, very different and very scary.
That's right. And in children's hospitals across this country, minors are being disfigured. They are doing these surgeries, and I can prove it. The name of that article that you just referenced there was inspired out of what happened here not just a few days ago, when Libs of TikTok, the Twitter account, released audio footage of staffers at National Children's Hospital here in Washington, D.C., saying on tape, there were two different people that she spoke to, saying that they did hysterectomies, gender affirming. For those of you who are listening by radio, I'm making air quotes because you should also always use air quotes when you say gender affirming, because there's nothing truly affirming about one's biology in these hysterectomies. This is completely medically unnecessary and unethical. Mm-hmm. But the staffers at National Children's said that they do indeed do these surgeries to girls who claim to be boys on 16-year-olds. Now, she had the archived screenshots of what their website said before they updated it after what broke loose with Boston Children's Hospital and what was exposed there. There's an article in the Journal of Clinical Medicine that showed that Boston Children's Hospital at their gender surgery center from 2017 to 2020 did 65 double mastectomies, breast amputations on minor girls. It's right there in the table chart. Just look up that journal article. It's right there. And so all of this media interference from the legacy press is saying, oh, this is lies, this is right-wing misinformation. No, if you actually look at the original source material, the documents in the journal articles, which are often written by gender clinicians themselves, and the doctors who are doing this kind of thing, it's their own words. All you have to do is requote them and show them the page number and the citation, and it's demonstrably true that it's happening. But by the time that this happened with the National Children's Hospital here in DC, I was just so enraged because I had not only known people who had minor children that were able to, for example, I know a mom whose daughter ran away to Oregon and got her breasts amputated and her entire reproductive system cut out at 17 as a minor. I know her personally, but then I also had seen some of these other medical journals like JAMA Pediatrics and the Journal of Sexual Medicine, the Journal of Clinical Medicine, as I mentioned, the Lancet, Obstetrics and Gynecology. These are prominent peer-reviewed medical journals that say right there, and I have it all listed in that article with the hyperlink so you can read it for yourself, that yes, children under the age of 18 are being disfigured. They are having their genitals amputated. They're having their reproductive systems cut out. They're having their breasts cut off. Doctors are doing this, and it's all couched in this high-minded and nuanced, sophisticated language, but it's happening. It's indisputable and irrefutable.
Well, and just the facing it in its reality and in all its ugliness, I think is something that's very difficult for people to do. And
right.
It comes across as, this can't be true. It sounds so outlandish that the people that we trust, the institutions that we trust to provide health and care for our children, I mean, why on earth would they do something that's terrible?
It's mixed in with, I'm sure there's plenty of good doctors at these children's hospitals taking care of sick kids.
Mm-hmm.
There's also something sinister going on.
And
both things can be true.
I'm not sure. Do you know when this happened and what is creating this medical consensus? I mean, I don't want to be so cynical to say it's entirely politics, but I have to believe that's a big part of it.
Oh,
How could it be that doctors who for their entire lives have studied biology and they know the difference between male and female organisms at a very basic level, like that's got to be 101. That's something that even you understand in grade school. So how is it that now they're submitting to and even they're complicit in and promoting this this active lie about
you're right.
humanity?
You're absolutely right, and it is so horrible that most people can't even fathom it, or they say, "Oh, it can't be that bad," or it's so bewildering that they don't even have any grid for understanding it, because it is insane. But there's a sort of analysis that paralysis that sets in, and if it's not affecting their immediate lives and they've got busy things to do, they can't be thinking about these things and can't be bothered. But you're not wrong to wonder about politics, because it's stunning to see the ideological capture that's happened throughout the medical field. And this has been sort of a slow burn, but the conditions were created that it has just caused an explosion, especially within the last 5 to 10 years. The first pediatric gender clinic, as they're called, first opened in, I think, 2007 in Boston, which Boston Children's Hospital has been in the news recently because, well, that's where it all kind of started in the United States. And now if you include Planned Parenthood clinics, which are passing out testosterone like candy to people who think, to girls who think that they're boys, and you can get it at age, I think you still have an age requirement for Planned Parenthood, but those aren't exactly scrupulous people, so it wouldn't surprise me at all if they're passing it out to minors. And I think you can in a state like Oregon, where I think the age of majority is 15. But it is so horrible. And so I've done a little bit of the digging to find out how certain medical groups like the Endocrine Society, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Pediatric Endocrine Society, all sort of prominent institutions, a few activists get in, they spoil the whole structure, then they take over and control the messaging to the media, and they change the character of a once regarded organization. But in the minds of the public, it's still this vaunted, prestigious place that's doing great research and great medical care. And so people just can't believe that a children's hospital would do something like this, or you name it. And doctors have great social trust in our society, and indeed many still are really good. They know their local pharmacist. They maybe hear a big conspiracy about big pharma or whatever, but they just can't let their minds go there because it is so bad. But I think that there are I think people are starting to wake up, because it's as it affects more and more people, and as more and more families are torn apart, the harms are just unignorable. And particularly now, as we're seeing a rising number of what are known as detransitioners. These are people who underwent these experimental hormones and surgeries, talk about how this left them with regret and a disfigured body and other sicknesses that the hormones caused, and other just terrible wreckage in their lives. As those stories get out, it begins to poke holes in this media created narrative that this is the standard of care, this is medical consensus, this is just the right thing to do, and you should affirm someone as the opposite sex and send them down this pathway. I think at some point the truth comes out, and it's undeniable. But the question is, how many have to be harmed in the meantime?
Right. And this is true harm that's happening. And I think a lot of people have
Devastating.
bought into, again, it's easy if it's in theory. If it's somebody else, if you think it's happening far away, if it's just theoretical, then it's easy to have opinions about it that don't really, have to come down firmly on one side or another. But I remember hearing, it was on Fox News, hearing the story of this little child who decided.
Was this in June?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
It was their Pride Month feature.
Yeah.
And I remember being shocked, like my jaw dropped when I heard the interview of the parents. And it was very sympathetic, which is why it was so shocking to come from Fox News. But, I guess one more shrimp on the Barbie. But the mom said in this interview about her child, she had bought into the blackmail. Yeah. And she had said why they were supporting their child, who was very young. I think it was like 6, maybe.
That's when it started.
It started at 6, and maybe the child was about 10 by this point. Yeah. But very early on. And the mom essentially said, this is almost a direct quote, "I would rather have a living daughter than a dead son."
That's the line that they use, the manipulative line that creates panicked, freezing fear in parents. It's so vile.
It rings in your ears, it rings in your brain, and how dare we blackmail parents? But every time, if you want, just follow libs of TikTok for a while.
If a doctor tells you that, you would be paralyzed in fear.
If you don't go along with whatever this child is thinking or feeling, which gives them all the power, which is a huge rush for a kid, why wouldn't you exploit that? And the teachers have to do what they say. They believe all the adults have to dance to their tune and say, oh, well, that's amazing. Because if you don't, your child is likely to kill themselves. And it's that kind of
Every parent's worst
reprehensible.
nightmare. Every
Right.
parent's worst nightmare. Yeah.
And yet I know you're following the stories of, and you met so many people who have been so hurt, whose lives have been destroyed by either going along with this, or it kind of happened to them through the back door. And I wonder if you'd be able to share some of what you've heard, a little bit of some of their stories as we talk today. I mean, I heard that one statement and I can't ever get it out of my head.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's very common, that line. And it's the main threat that gender activists use to neutralize their opposition, because then it not only creates fear and, gives a lot of control to the kid, but it also makes you look like the bad guy if you object. And so you do what you really, what if this child does commit suicide? And you know what? There have been some young people who were gender confused that have indeed taken their lives. So that it does play upon something that has happened where their psychological distress was so bad that they did wind up taking their own lives. But it's such dark, evil manipulation. And it's just, I get very hot under the collar when I hear that's put to parents. But some version of that is what they are routinely told, and that they'll wind up with self-harm. That even if they don't go with the suicide, there's all these other risks that create a lot of fear. And then not only that, but they're told that puberty blockers, for example, are completely reversible. So you can go back if you can just try this, or, there's all these other things that are said to assuage their fears that, this is totally approved. It's a lie. But these activists that get into these institutions and do this kind of, I don't say medicine, I say medicalization, because it's not sound ethically at all. They got a whole script that they follow, and they manipulate parents into thinking that this is just the way it has to be. There's a whole culture of manipulation and fear. It's so bad. And to give you an example of a story, I have profiled some families, two of which they didn't give me their real names on the record, but they wanted to sort of expose these dynamics that go on within these settings. And so I reported their story. I have reported another mother who has lost her children, and her story is out there. She did use her real name, but I think it's relevant for me to share now the fact that when you go into these clinics, in addition to, if you're not, a parent, but you're someone who's struggling, and you think that you are trans. I spoke to a man who ultimately underwent an orchiectomy, the amputation of his testicles. And on his first visit to this gender clinic, it was a nurse. She may have just been even an intern, but she told him, if you think you're trans, you are trans. It was just that on the first thing. And then he then proceeded to tell me, and he sent me his medical records. I reviewed them, and I corroborated his story with others who knew him, that he told me that when he would go into these appointments, it was kind of a mad rush, but they never used biologically accurate words for his anatomy. And so the way he was enticed into these various, medical procedures and hormones and surgeries, it was like his body was kind of like this massive blob of interchangeable parts. And he thought that when they presented an orchiectomy to him, they may have used that word, but they said, we're just going to remove the tiny part of your body that makes the testosterone. They didn't say the word testicle.
Wow.
So here,
surgeons did not.
These people in white coats, they told him, people he thinks got their degrees on the wall. These are people who know what they're doing. So he's thinking, well, they're just going to take a teeny little piece out of my, private parts, and I'm going to be fine. Because he was wanting to get off hormones because his endocrine system was seriously hijacked, because you can't just mess with that and not have any complications.
Right.
So he eventually ended up going through with the surgery thinking, this will get me off hormones, and this is just going to be a tiny little piece of my body that's missing, but it won't affect how it looks, feels, or functions. He was told that.
Really?
But then he wakes up and he's castrated completely, and he takes the bandages off, and he then describes what it was like looking at his genitals and saying, I never hated how they looked, but now it looked weird. And I think he said his line to me, it looked like his scrotum looked like the thing that hanged off a chicken's neck. I mean,
Oh no.
he's so disfigured. And he wound up with some serious problems. And here's the cruelest irony of it all. He attempted suicide after that. It didn't succeed, but here he's believing that this is going to help him.
Mhm.
He then starts thinking about ways he might take his own life. It's a brutal meat grinder. It's just this. I can't believe I live in a country where this happens. Like I learned about this kind of thing, and it's just like, how in the world is this even real? Am I, I know I'm not crazy, but I get these phone calls and they send me pictures, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, what's going on?
Well, and that anybody should have to be put through this under the and so there's a big argument going on online right now about consent and about whether or not things should be allowed, even if they're bad. Like the government shouldn't take that ability to, do whatever you want to with your own body and all of that.
The
Which
freedom.
that argument only leads to good things, right?
Yeah.
And nothing bad could ever come from that argument. But I mean, aside that anyone should the lies that people are telling themselves and the distress that they're in, the mental confusion that they're in, such that they believe that in order to become truly who they are on the inside, they have to cut off parts of their outside. I mean, just saying that out loud in its simplest form, we understand that that is not a right way of thinking. That is not a healthy way of thinking. You would not do that. Most people would say you would never do that to somebody for any other reason. Would you say, I have to cut off my ear in order to be my true self, or I have to cut off my arms in order to, you would never do that. You'd say, no, we're going to help you. We're going to love you enough to help you because you were made in a good way and you don't need to cut off your body parts because, that's not the way. That's not the path to happiness and joy. But the fact that we're allowing anyone to do it is reprehensible, but that we're suffering children under this level, again, as you talked about, you have proof that doctors are willing to and are performing these atrocities on children. And many times parents have no say about it. Either they're cowed into compliance with that emotional blackmail, saying this is all the only way you can do to save your child's life. You have to go along with this. The child that you knew is dead, and you have to use their name, and you have to use their new identity. And if you don't, well, you don't have a child anymore, and they might even die. That is
family courts, or they use the family courts to make you bend to their will. I know of cases where that's happening. I mean, it's the whole state apparatus is the machinery of this as well.
So in light of all of that, what do we do, Brandon? How do we, we've got like 10 minutes. How do we fix this? It's a giant mess. And I don't mean to make light of it because this is heartbreak. Like literally, if your heart doesn't rend when you hear these stories, then know that the real pain, the real destruction and death, that this is, I think your word is appropriate, demonic. This is the work of the devil. And it's it will require nothing less, I think, than a supernatural, miraculous healing of our nation, of our hearts, of our minds in order to counteract this. But I do believe that's possible. I do believe in the power of redemption, but we have to, I think, first of all, stem the destruction that's going on relatively unchecked. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I know there are voices like yours speaking out. So where do you see the hope for redemption, the hope for beginning to counteract this type of just pure evil?
Well, I totally agree with what you said there about the supernatural and God intervening. And ultimately that is what has spurred me on, because it is dark. It's like staring into the abyss of evil some days. And I can't even believe that I've kept my sanity sometimes. And I have good people praying, and there are people who are loud and not shutting up, and I will never shut up. And because I won't have it on my conscience to see children disfigured and sterilized. I will not shut up about it. No, absolutely not. So I am hopeful that, Jesus doesn't take too kindly when you hurt children. There isn't, in my estimation, and I want to keep my heart clean, and I don't want to delight in the death of the wicked because God doesn't. But there isn't a millstone heavy enough for these people that are doing this to kids. I mean, just the raw evil of it. I feel all the emotions about it. This is one of the worst medical scandals the world has ever seen. But the first step is to come to grips with the fact that it is as bad as you think, the way I'm describing it. Multiply it by 10, then you're probably close with how bad it is out there. I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm not exaggerating. It's terrible what's happening to children across this country in children's hospitals and in clinics. So you've got to break yourself out of your stupor and realize that It is as bad as you think. And so then ask the Lord. I don't, when people ask me for specific advice, I say, I can't tell you what to do, but you got to get on your knees and pray. And that is so powerful in and of itself. But you ask the Lord what your role is, then whatever he says, you just do that. But I think one of the biggest things that people can do, and it's a point that I made earlier, is refuse to participate in any of this with what you say. Because if the gender activists can control what you say, they can control what you think. And so refuse to take part in any of this lingo, especially if you're in a profession where you have to be public. This is, again, not talking about pastors here who are dealing with people on the ground and they may have to make some tough calls, even though, again, I'm usually of the mind that you don't really ever lend credence to any of this. Don't use language that obscures and obfuscates and covers this stuff up, because that's probably half the ball field. If you intellectually assent to this ideology that has taken over our very means of communication and you use their words, they've already got you by the throat. I mean, you're neutered. I mean, so I think that's just, that can't be overstated. Whenever you here's the other thing, and this, I see Christians sort of doing this and it drives me bonkers, even though I know why. For years, sex and gender were used interchangeably. And I understand why, because if you look at the etymological roots of the word gender, you see the word gene, as in genetics. So there's a link to biology there. And even in medicine, back until just a few decades ago, the word gender was linguistic. It wasn't a medicalized term. But I think Christians will be better served, and not just Christians, but anybody, if when you say gender, if you mean sex, but you're saying gender, force the conversation to be about sex, because what gender activism does is try to abolish sex. Sex is always the target. So never say the word gender when what you really mean is sex. Okay. Even though you've used those terms interchangeably, and it's understandable why, if you don't understand that sex is the target, because gender is where there's been this systematic gaslighting. They'll say, I'm not trying to change my sex. That's impossible. I'm just trying to change my gender, but that's different. No, they're lying to you. They are trying to take, measures to change their sex because they're cutting off sex organs.
Right.
They're ministering drugs that's rendering their reproductive systems be infertile. That's the sex of the body. So don't let all the gender speak fool you. Don't get it twisted.
Yeah, well, they're reaffirming the sexual or gender binary with everything that they do, except for their words, right?
Right.
And
there's only carnage and heartache in its wake. And here's something I think that as people look ahead about what can be done, I genuinely believe that in the Lord's timing, and whenever he does bring an end to this, because I do believe that there is going to be some kind of divine intervention. How and when and where, I don't know, but I believe it will be soon. But I think that Christians need to really be preparing for how we're going to be how we're going to have to be ministering to a lot of people who are really hurting, because it's excruciating torture when this invades a family. And then you deal with the health problems from the kids who have gone on these drugs or they've been disfigured in a clinic. God can do amazing miracles, but I think we're going to have to be really prepared to walk through people who've been suffering, and it's a suffering that hasn't been aired much. It's very hard for people to talk about this because people don't know how to deal with it. You need to just be ready to go low and go slow and abide with people as they process the evil that has been unleashed on them. And that's going to take a lot of fortitude, but nothing is impossible with the Lord. And that's not a cliche. It's really true.
Amen.
So start thinking about how you might minister to a lot of people, because the refugees from this medical scandal are coming.
Right. And those are voices that are, despite every attempt to silence them, are incredibly valuable. The people who have the courage to speak out and say, this is what I did. This is what was done to me. This is what I regret. Here's what I'm suffering today because of it. And are finding, hopefully, the support that they need, even if, it's from maybe unorthodox quarters. And the truth, and as we come kind of to the end of our conversation, although I'd love to continue this at a later time, if your time and interest allow, Brandon, because there's going to be an awful lot more on this topic, I know. The passage that came to mind when you were saying this was Ephesians 5, and roundabout verse 11, We know, take no part in unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them, for it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible, for anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. So there is both a lot of darkness and a lot of light we have before us. And it is for such a time as this that God has put us here. This is a battlefield, and all we got to do is get equipped, gird ourselves up, and go forth. And I think, as you said, that can look different in different situations. We can't participate in the delusion. We can't participate in a lie, and we must speak the truth in love when it comes down to just honoring God's good design of men and women, and loving the things that he loves, loving the people that he loves well and in truth, and at the same time understanding the level of hurt that is being done, and the level of deception that, we've all believed lies, and we've all hurt ourselves and hurt everyone we love as a consequence. And because as such, we're some of us, I think hopefully we can reach out in compassion to be able to minister, because, no matter what the devil tries to perpetuate, God still has the victory over death itself. So when our sin is, our sin is creating the destruction and death in our bodies, but God yet has the victory. And we serve a God who defeated death himself. So that is where we find our hope. And that's the hope that's available to all who hear our voices today through Jesus Christ. Brandon Showalter has been our excellent guest. Check out his work at the Christian Post. Not easy to wade through the depths that he has to and tell the stories that he has to tell. I'm so glad that he has the courage to share, and the compassion to share what's going on, to share stories of people who are being hurt, ripped apart by this gender destruction. But ultimately that he has the hope of Jesus Christ as well, that he can shine in this very dark place. Thank you for helping us today, Brandon. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Check out his work. I'll link the article we were talking about below, but really just read everything he writes and follow him for some insights that, maybe, I don't know if it's warm and fuzzy, but it's definitely something that the people of God need to be fully equipped. We need to be fully armored up, guys. And I would say, especially to the moms and dads, to the grandmas and grandpas in this audience, this is the type of thing that has to motivate us. And I know I hate it when politicians say it, but it's for the children. Like, if nothing else, this is we have to live like what we say is about the Bible, what we say about God is actually true. Amen. We need to believe this to the core of our being. And if God made us well, then all of these confusions are just lies. And he has such kindness towards us. He has such mercy towards us. And he can perhaps allow us to be merciful towards the people that are trapped in lies and reveal his love for them. So let's lead with love and not obfuscate or not be cowed by lies, but at the same time, love the people that God loves and see them the way that he sees them, affirm them as good creations, male and female, made in his image. That's all for today. If you like this conversation, or, you just want to make some leftists mad, you can feel free to share. Find all your podcasts at iHeart and Spotify and iTunes and all those good places. Also on YouTube, if we haven't been canceled yet this week, and on Facebook at FaithWorks Live. Share it with a friend. And until next time, we have a mission, so let's be about it.